What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another review roundup, this time around about the Scream movies that have come out up to this point. Scream, Scream 2, Scream 3, and Scream 4, right ahead of the release of Scream 5 that is actually not called Scream 5, and they're calling it Scream. Why? Why, Hollywood? Why have you continued to do this with these horror remakes that are not remakes, that are sequels to the original films, and you just call them the same thing as the original? We've now done it with Halloween, where now not only do we have a Halloween that is a sequel to the original Halloween that erases the other ones, there's also a remake that's also called Halloween. So there are 3 Halloweens. Candyman just did it, just essentially made a film that completely erases the second and third film and plays as a general sequel to the original film that is also titled Candyman. I just don't get why we're doing this. This is clearly a sequel that's coming out. It's got the same actors reprising the same roles from the other 4 films. Why not just call it Scream 5 when all of the other ones have numbers in their titles? Even give it a subtitle, you know, Scream, A New Generation, Scream, A New Dawn, Scream, Louder, who knows? Whatever the case may be, I don't understand why Hollywood is consistently doing this. So, as you can see, I'm framed a little bit differently than I usually am, where I'm more off to the side and I usually have a poster up. Quite frankly, I just kind of want to talk about this franchise a little bit more openly than necessarily a breakdown on each individual film. I mean, I will give my general thoughts on each film, but this isn't going to be my traditional kind of review roundup or my traditional kind of review. It's going to be a little bit more of just a discussion about the franchise in and of itself. For those who are not familiar with the Scream series, it is a slasher series that is an incredibly self-aware and meta approach to the slasher franchise. It was the second and probably the most successful attempt at a meta kind of very self-aware approach to telling slasher stories, given from Wes Craven, the director of these 4 films. Now, his first venture into that was his film New Nightmare in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise that kind of went with a very self-aware approach to a Freddy Krueger story. Very different than this one, but yeah, that was kind of his first attempt into something like that. And then he would go on to make the Scream films, and I think it's awesome that he was able to stick around and direct all 4 of the films. Of course, he has since passed away, so he's not directing the new one, but you know, he was very vocal about the fact that his other creation, Freddy Krueger, wasn't necessarily treated the way that he would have liked to have seen him treated in the sequels. And though Wes Craven would come back to help with certain writing elements in certain sequels later on, and of course would go on to direct A New Nightmare that came out, you know, pretty much at the end of the franchise, yeah, you know, he wasn't necessarily always the biggest fan of what they did with the sequels for the Nightmare on Elm Street films, and honestly felt like, you know, they kind of churned it out to not necessarily be the best, in a lot of ways just kind of to be garbage after a while. I've covered all those films here on the channel, and in a lot of ways he's completely right. There are a lot of installments in the Freddy Krueger franchise that are really, really bad, but the Freddy Krueger franchise is not the only franchise that suffers from that. Even my favorite slasher franchise, the Chucky franchise, the Child's Play franchise, is, you know, definitely famous for having some pretty weird installments in the franchise, some stinkers. And if you're not into that all the way, or you're not really into it being kind of over the top and dumb, then you're not going to like it. And so ultimately, a lot of slasher franchises that may have started off serious over the course of time just became jokes in and of themselves, and the enjoyment came out of a completely different approach to watching films than you typically would when you walk into a movie and want to see a good movie. So with the Scream franchise, Wes Craven was really able to, you know, kind of hit the nail on the head when it comes to making a series that has a kind of grounded approach to telling a story, while also being very, very self-aware and very meta in its storytelling, and in and of itself is a film that knows it's a film, is referencing the fact that it is a film, and it even gets to a point where we have a character in each of these films that lays out the ground rules for the characters of what they can and can't do, the things that will and will not happen in a slasher film, depending on where we are in the series. So in the first film, again, you have the rules set out for what would happen in this original slasher slasher film. And in the sequel, it makes jokes about the fact that it knows it is a sequel and that the events that are happening here are essentially, you know, the sequel to the events of the first one. And so now the rules have changed. There are certain rules that have stayed the same, some that have changed, some that have shifted, some new rules have appeared. And with the third and fourth installment, they make references to where they are in the franchise at all time. So I really always enjoyed that about this series. I love that it's able to poke fun at itself. I think that Wes Craven and everybody involved had a lot of fun doing that. And ultimately, what I really enjoy about it is the balance of telling a grounded, serious story where our characters believe they're in a real situation. They're not going for overly goofy, but at the same time, there is a huge layer of goofiness over all of these films. And the character of Ghostface, the killer that's in all of these films, that is played by a different person in each of the films, I think is a great character. It's a character that can be anyone. It doesn't matter who it is, but the voice is iconic, and just the overall look, the feel, the vibe, those phone calls, everything about it is just classic. And I think that Wes Craven created a really classic series with these 4 films. Now, I think the first 2, without a doubt, are the best. So getting into my actual thoughts on the films, I think the third and fourth kind of aren't necessarily necessary at times. There's an element of feeling like, why do the third and fourth film really need to happen? I think the second one does a great job of being like, oh man, this is happening again. You know, it plays off of the, you know, slasher tropes and the fact that this character is reliving her history. And I think they're able to do some interesting things narratively while also having fun with that self-aware element. The third and fourth, I still think do a good job of that, but I would definitely say are probably my lesser favorites in the franchise. But with that said though, I still do like the third and fourth. I know that they get a lot of crap and some people think the third film is not a good film, but I would argue that maybe the third film is better than the fourth film, and the fourth film is the one where I feel like the franchise maybe overstayed its welcome just a little bit. Overall though, I enjoy all these films, and revisiting them almost like a TV show where I watched all 4 across 2 days, I had a lot of fun. Overall, I was really engaged in the story, revisiting it. I found the acting and everything to, you know, be a good balance of grounded when it needed to be, while also being very cheesy and leaning into the series and to the franchise and into the genre overall. And if you are a fan of slasher films like I am, and I've talked about it here on the channel on many occasions, yeah, you know, there's so much fun to be had with this series when it comes to the different references and hints and nods and jokes that it's making in terms of the whole genre. If you're familiar with majority of the big name slashers and all of their sequels, then without a doubt you can enjoy these films and have a laugh. You don't even really need to have seen all of them, but if you're familiar with the slasher genre overall, if you've seen a decent amount, these movies do a really great job of poking fun at the genre overall, while also, I feel, telling a pretty fun story. Some of the reveals as to who some of the killers are in some of the movies aren't necessarily all that great. I think still the first film overall does it the best. I think the first film overall is the best one, but I would argue that maybe the second one does a better job of kind of building upon the characters and the story that's kind of, you know, being played off of the first one. I would argue that the second one is where the story actually gets a little bit more interesting at times, whereas the first one's a little bit more straightforward slasher. But I think that the first one has that upper hand of being, you know, the first time that this was done. It's very clever, it feels new, it feels fresh, whereas the second one and the third one and the fourth one are obviously playing off of the first one and doing that in a way that it's 100% self-aware. The opening scene of the second film is actually the first ever Scream thing that I would ever see, and it is the opening scene where now in this universe there are movies being made called Stab that literally have the Ghostface killer in them and are based on the events of the first film. And over the course of these films we get deeper into the Stab series, where there's a bunch of Stab movies at this point, and all of those Stab movies, you know, are playing off of that original film while also now doing their own thing. But you literally have multiple actresses who over the course of time have played Neve Campbell's character from the first film, Sidney Prescott, while also having people in the film who play Gail Weathers, who is actually played by Courteney Cox, you know, the real version in these films, and then the character of Dewey as well, played by David Arquette. Yeah, I think that these films do a really good job over the course of time with their sequels. Even if they feel like they don't necessarily feel all that necessary, they poke fun at the fact that they're not all that necessary, and that at this point in the series certain rules have just completely been thrown out the window, because again, it is trying to be a very self-aware approach to a slasher series, whereas, you know, this far into a slasher series, in a lot of cases 3 films in with some of them, or 4 films in, and even sometimes even the second film in, you know, a lot of times it just takes a huge dip in the storytelling if the first one maybe had some sort of magic. And so yeah, I think that these films do a really good job overall of handling that. Again, I think that the fact that Wes Craven was able to be at the the helm for all 4 of them is really awesome. Again, especially since he has had his comments here and there about the way that they handled his other baby with Freddy Krueger. And ultimately, you know, as a huge slasher fan, like I have Chucky tattooed on my leg, as a huge slasher fan, I can admit that the franchise or the genre overall, the various franchises, are not always the best. The narratives are usually terrible, and it's all about the kills, the imagery, and a lot of the goofy elements that make the genre what it is. And I think that Wes Craven had a lot of fun with these 4 films. You know, I think there's an element sometimes that all these films can feel like they kind of blend together. There's an element where sometimes you feel like there is a sameness to, you know, the films and some of the side characters. You kind of start to think, oh, which characters were in which film. But overall, I think that the films do a really good job of having their own little fun story in each of them that kind of makes the Ghostface experience slightly different. And of course, you have that very self-aware element that's going on within the films with the stab movies and the characters literally listing out the rules for that film. So overall, I do really enjoy this series. I'm looking forward to checking out the new one tomorrow. I'll be watching it later tomorrow night. I know some people have already seen it, and from some of the reviews I'm seeing already or been hearing or reading about, it seems like people are really thoroughly enjoying it, and it seems like some people are actually saying that it's better than the original or just as good or the best the series has been since the original, even if it's any of those really, or even just another good Scream movie. I'm really excited to see these actors return. Yeah, I just want to highlight a couple of different elements really quickly before I wrap up this video. Of course, I mentioned before Neve Campbell, you know, you have Courteney Cox, you have David Arquette, you also have Matthew Lillard and Skeet Ulrich in the first film. They're definitely standout characters in that first film. One thing that I've always kind of found funny, Drew Barrymore, of course, is iconic for the opening of this movie. She's on the poster, and it's so funny how small her role is in this film, but how iconic her presence in the film is. I just actually watched it with my fiance and the Big Rob Theory. It was their first time watching the film, and yeah, my fiance was just like, you know, I totally thought she would be in this film way more based on kind of how I've always thought of her being in this film. So yeah, I think the fact that she's all over the marketing, that she's in most of like the imagery for the film sometimes is funny when she's really not in the film for very long at all. Definitely also have to praise the voice, or the guy who plays the voice modulator that's in the mask every time, that people use every time they're the killer. It's played by Roger Jackson. He always does the voice, and yeah, you know, he's great as the character Ghostface. I think the voice fits the character. It's iconic, it's classic, and every time you hear it in one of these films, it's great. So yeah, top-notch work from Roger Jackson. And this franchise has a lot of big faces throughout, some that were big when the films were coming out, some that weren't so big when they were coming out. And yeah, you know what I really enjoy about this series is seeing a lot of these faces. People like Jada Pinkett Smith, Timothy Olyphant, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Jerry O'Connell, Patrick Dempsey, Jenny McCarthy, Emily Mortimer, Patrick Warburton, Jay and Silent Bob. They make a cameo in one of these, in the third one actually. You have Judy Hicks, the character of Judy Hicks that's played by Marley Shelton, who is reprising her role for the new one as well. Then we also have Hayden Panettiere and Emma Roberts. There's been a lot of big faces, and there's some that I didn't even list here. I just wanted to write down some of them because there's a lot of big faces in this series that you'll see, even if they're in smaller roles. And I think overall, going back and watching these, there is a cheesy element of definitely it being of its time, you know, but ultimately I do think that they do a really good job. I think Wes Craven made a really fun series, and I am looking forward to the new film. So I'm going to stop rambling now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, a little bit different of an approach to my review roundups, but ultimately I would say that my ranking for this series, if I had to, which I don't really do here on the channel, but I would say the first is still my favorite, the second one being a really close second in my opinion, a film that I find to be a little bit more entertaining in a lot of ways than the first film, but maybe not fully as good as the first film. And then I would say then maybe the third and fourth are kind of, you know, battling for the next spot, but I'll give the third that slight edge just a little bit. But overall, I really enjoy the series, looking forward to the fifth one, and I definitely can't wait to hear what you guys have to say. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.